also very excited tonight to have Professor Erwin Kotler with us, who will share a few words in a moment. Before we move on, I think it's important for us to talk about why we're here, why this is so important. Obviously, the problem of anti-Semitism broadly has some. I mean, it's sort of an endless problem, but in recent years, the last decade in particular, we've seen a dramatic increase. And then in particular, this last year, we have seen an increase in hate crime across the board. And a large proportion of that has been an increase in anti-Semitic violence specifically. So it's very much front of mind for many of us. I think it's also, in some respects, front of mind for federal authorities, and I think we've seen that in a number of ways through the summit on anti-Semitism this summer, which was chock-a-block with incredible recommendations moving forward, and we will be watching that all very closely to see how that unveils itself. Also, more recently, of course, we were represented well at the Malmo meetings just a week or so ago around anti-Semitism. Both the Prime Minister and Professor Kotler were in attendance there, and through that, and I think through other recent statements and initiatives, have committed to, a powerful and hopefully long-term focus on countering anti-Semitism. So we certainly appreciate that, and in particular, I think the appointment of Dr. Kotler as the special envoy on anti-Semitism and Holocaust, I think is another indication of that, and hopefully will lead us down the road towards a national action plan on anti-Semitism as well. So that's enough from me for right now. So I would like to introduce to you someone who, for many of you, probably needs no introduction, but I'll do so anyway because it's just such an honor to have him with us. The Honorable Erwin Kotler is an emeritus professor of law at McGill University. He's the founder and international chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and a longtime parliamentarian. He's a member of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom, Canada's special envoy, as we said, for preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism, and member of the Organization of American States expert legal panel on Venezuela. He is clearly an international human rights lawyer, counsel to political prisoners, and has been referred to as counsel for the oppressed and Freedoms Council. As I mentioned, the Honorable Erwin Kotler was a key part of the Canadian delegation to the recent Malmo Forum on Anti-Semitism. That delegation was led by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and joined by the Honorable Stefan Dion, Ambassador to Germany and Special Envoy of the Prime Minister to the European Union and Europe, among others. So I thank you, Professor Kotler, for joining us, and turn it to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, for those kind words of introduction. I'm really delighted to be able to participate in this webinar on anti-Semitic hate crime, which is as timely as it is necessary and appropriately enough, one organized by your own Center on Hate, Bias and Extremism in Ontario Tech. In particular, I'm looking forward, as I'm sure we all are, to Matthew Stein's comprehensive research project on anti-Jewish hate crimes. The findings and recommendations in that project not only dovetail with my work now as special envoy and help to underpin that work, but it actually dovetails with a lot of my work when I was a law professor researching in this area, or an intervenant before the Supreme Court on the Keekstra et al. Cases, which dealt with hate speech and hate crimes. And I just recalled when you were speaking that I actually, as Minister of Justice, launched the first ever national justice initiative against racism and hate. So this is bringing a lot of things together for me. And as you appreciate, your particular study and your work really is engaging all stakeholders, be they government ministers or government agencies or parliamentarians or academics or NGOs, organizations like the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Amir Al-Gharabi just wrote a piece on matters regarding hate crime reporting and the like. So this is, as I said, very timely and necessary study. In a word, and as you put it, it's the first study of its kind in the sense that it provides a baseline for appreciating the depth, the breadth, and the impact of hate-motivated hate crimes, and how those hate crimes target the Jewish community, which, as studies have shown, while it is only 1% of the population, nonetheless is a target of some 19% of hate crimes, as it was set forth in the Simon Wiesenthal Center study of it in 2018. And we have, of course, studies that have dovetailed with this. And, you know, as we meet at this point, Statistics Canada, while it reported, and sometimes this could be misleading, that crime declined in 2020, hate crimes increased 37% in that year. The annual audit by B'nai B'rith showed that 2020 had the highest rise ever with respect to anti-Semitic incidents, and it was the 5th year in a row that such incidents rose. There was, as I said, the last study done by the Simon Wiesenthal Center in 2018, and all this is against the backdrop, which we sometimes forget about, underreporting or non-reporting of hate crimes. And in fact, the recent European Commission report, and it was shared by Katharina von Schnurbein in a recent webinar, she said, you know, the data is much higher in reality because our information reports that most people are not reporting hate crimes, either because they don't know to whom they should report it, or they don't know how to report it, or for the most part, they don't trust that if they do report, it will even be acted upon. So she said, in effect, the number of hate crimes is much larger than even their study demonstrated with regard to anti-Semitic hate crimes against European Jews. And what is most disturbing is that, and with this I move to a close, is that in May 2021, we reached the highest level of anti-Semitic incidences already by May 2021 than we had reached in all of the year 2020, which itself was the year that had the highest rise of anti-Semitic incidences, where Jews, as you know in your own work, were targeted and threatened in their neighborhoods and in the streets, on the campuses, and in communities where, regrettably, synagogues were torched, Holocaust memorials defaced, cemeteries desecrated, Jewish institutions vandalized, the whole resulting in from an empirical perspective, not only in a precipitative rise in anti-Semitic and hate-motivated crimes, but also in an exponential and indeed incendiary increase on anti-Semitic hate speech on the social media, where, as it was reported at the time, there was in 1 week 17,000 tweets on the variation of the theme that Hitler was right, and that alone could be the subject of a seminar of this incendiary hate speech in the social media. And so I was pleased, as you mentioned, Barbara, that there was a national summit to combat anti-Semitism that was held on July 21st. I shared at that time a prospective action plan for combating hate and combating anti-Semitism. But I have to say that I was very moved in particular by the testimony of the lived experiences of 2 testimonies there. One was a student who described how he had been bullied and marginalized and maligned within the campus culture, effectively called upon to, in fact, choose between his Jewish identity and participating in the campus culture, the progressive campus culture. And there was a Black Jewish woman who embodied intersectionality, who said how she had been targeted as a woman, as a Black, but mostly as a Jew. And the Prime Minister, who had given opening remarks at the summit, responded how those 2 testimonies in particular moved him and shared why that Canada therefore sees the combating of anti-Semitism as part of the larger struggle for human rights and human dignity in Canada and beyond. And as you mentioned, Barbara, recently we had the Malmo conference. Prime Minister made a number of country pledges with regard to Canada. This included, number one, the enhancement of not only Holocaust education, but education anti-Semitism, based really on the principle the Holocaust is a paradigm for radical evil, anti-Semitism is a paradigm for radical hate, and anti-Semitism is, and the Prime Minister references, the canary in the mine shaft of global evil today. The second was the need to combat hate crimes. When I said it, I had addressed a national summit with a national action plan. One of the priorities in my national action plan was the combating of hate crimes. And I used the 4 Ps that I developed actually when I was Minister of Justice in this regard. The prevention of such hate crimes, the protection of the victims, the prosecution of the perpetrators, and partnerships between federal, provincial, municipal law enforcement agencies and all the stakeholders with which you work, civil society, and the like. The third, and this feeds into it as well, support, as the Prime Minister said, not only for IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance intergovernmental organization, but for IRA's working definition on anti-Semitism, which can be used as a resource, as an asset to help underpin the understanding of anti-Semitism, to help it facilitate recognizing it, monitoring it, and thereby facilitating the combating of it. And in this regard, the Prime Minister referenced the need for a national action plan against hate. And therefore, what you are doing in this webinar this evening, the report that we are going to hear, this is something that I'm really looking forward to as I look forward to continuing to working together in common cause.
Thank you so much for those kind words. I think it really does provide a wonderful context for the conversation that we're going to have tonight, sharing with you what we've seen and heard on the hustings, if you will, over the last, I guess, year and a half of the study. Irina, can you put up the slides now, please? Okay, so as I mentioned, this is really, this is a starting point for us in sharing our findings. This is the first sort of public expression of what we've seen and what we've heard in our study. And so we just want to talk a little bit about, what some of the dimensions are, what some of the experiences have been around hate crime for the Jewish community in Canada. And also, as the title suggests, a little bit about the consequences as well. And that's something I'm especially interested in, is the impacts, the consequences of hate crime, not just for the immediate victims, but for the broader community as well. And that came very clear, especially in the interviews, but to some extent in the surveys as well. So what we see here, so what does anti-Semitism look like in Canada? This is really, these are the headlines, literally the headlines that we have taken from recent newspapers, recent media reports. So, we're seeing here, not just what the hate crime looks like in terms of the swastikas and the slurs and the anti-Semitic chants, but also to some extent the impacts as well. I no longer feel safe in this city. And I think, obviously that's the intent, isn't it, of hate crime perpetrators, to instill that sort of fear, the sort of fear that silences individuals and communities, and that in fact separates communities as well. Next slide, Irina. Thank you. Professor Kotler referred to the hate crime data. The 2020 data will come out soon. We did see preliminary data in the general report on crime trends for 2020. And of course, we did see yet another increase in hate crime generally and anti-Semitic hate crime specifically. But I think, as you can see from just this table from the report on 2019, fairly consistent that with respect to religiously motivated hate crime, that the Jewish community is the most frequently targeted. Muslim community came very close in 2017 when we saw that dramatic 151% increase, but consistently across the board, year over year, in Canada, in the US, and a lot of other Western countries as well, the Jewish community tends to be the most vulnerable to hate crime. Next one. I think I should also add, Professor Cole, you also mentioned, sort of that underreporting, and some of you might have seen in the media recently conversations about the GSS data that showed that for 2019, 2020, there were over 223,000 hate crimes reported in the GSS. So that is people responding in the affirmative that they had been a target of a crime and that it was motivated by some element of their identity. So 223,000 of those, about 48,000 were actually reported to police for about the 22%. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Just the tip of the iceberg is what we see. The interesting gap, that's a big enough gap, but the other interesting gap is that in any given year, if we look at the police reported data on hate crime, it's always just under 2,000. So, it's not 48,000 as are reported, apparently from what we know about the GSS, but there are multiple gaps in the data as we move through. So I think that's something that we need to unpack as well. And that's part of the work that we're doing. So one of the other sources of data that we often turn to is the B'nai B'rith annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents. Now, this is much broader. This is not just hate crime. This includes other forms of discrimination and hate speech as well, media images, that sort of thing, which isn't going to be captured in the official data. But we still see here, looking at these data, a dramatic increase over the past couple of years across the country and in some parts of the country in particular. So in Ontario, for example, largest province with the largest proportion of Jews, a 44% increase in that period of time. So it is obviously a pressing problem, becoming more problematic rather than less so. Next slide, Irina. Okay. So what we want to share with you, and I will turn it over to my colleagues, is, as I said, the sort of preliminary findings of our report, Anti-Semitic Hate Crime in Canada. It was a pilot study funded by SSHRC, Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, through an insight. Sorry, it was an insight development grant. So I think what was it, 2 years, I think it was rewarded. So it's taken us 2 years to gather the data. And we have conducted both surveys and interviews. And we had just over 50, I think it was 58, sorry, interviews. And that was split between people we identified as community leaders, so people who were part of a community-based organization, but as well as participants in the survey who indicated their willingness to participate in an interview after the fact. So what we're presenting here is a little bit of both of those. And you'll see that in many spots there is some consistency between what we observed in the surveys and the interviews. In some spots there are some inconsistencies, and those are the sorts of things that we really want to tease out moving forward. So I think it's over to you now, Irina. Is that right?
Yes, that's me. Thank you. So I'll start with a little bit of some background or a little bit of some basic information about some of the demographics of people that filled out the survey. So we see in the at the top of the table that we had slightly more male respondents than we did female respondents. In terms of the city of residence, For the study, we identified Ontario and Quebec as hotspots for anti-Semitism based on Statistics Canada data. And within Ontario and Quebec, we chose 6 cities specifically to focus on because these cities had large Jewish populations. And what we see here is that, the majority of our respondents were from Toronto, but I should note that Toronto encompasses a large geographic area, and it includes sort of all of the Greater Toronto area, which includes Toronto proper. It includes York region, Peel region, and Durham region as well. And then we also see in the age range that we had a little bit of difficulty in trying to engage the younger age ranges. And so we do have a bit of an overrepresentation for those participants who are over 60. We have a little bit more of a balanced distribution of age ranges in the interviews that were conducted, but it certainly limits our understanding of the experiences of anti-Semitism of the younger age ranges. And then another question that we asked was denomination. And we found that, for most participants, they identified with conservative Judaism most frequently. And then the second most common denomination was cultural Judaism, or those that identified as non-religious. And then finally, we also asked about markers of Jewish identity that were worn by participants. And it's interesting to note that this question allowed for sort of multiple answer choices. So there are some participants that wear more than one marker of Jewish identity, but the most common one is the Magen David, or the Star of David, and that's followed by the kippah, or the head covering that's worn by men. So in one of the first explicit statements of anti-Semitism from Canadian federal authorities was the turning away of the MS St. Louis in 1939 that was full of Jewish refugees under the precept that none is too many. Our interviews, unfortunately, also illuminated that there are several historical tropes that continue to persist to this present day. Including stereotypes about appearance and the caricaturization of Jewish people as having horns. And this was sort of illuminated in our interviews where a few participants even stated that they had people come up to them and ask them, "Where are your horns?" Blood libel was also a commonly experienced trope by participants, and unfortunately, also throwing pennies or coins in general at Jewish respondents was also reported. And I also wanted to mention that in both the survey and the interviews, many experiences of anti-Semitism were expressed through the context of anti-Israel sentiments. And the participants that identified these types of anti-Israel sentiments as anti-Semitic, they made clear that criticism of Israeli policy is not the same thing as anti-Semitism. But that the line between legitimate criticism of policy and action and anti-Semitism may not be clear and to a degree subjective. There was consensus, there was some consensus that sentiments expressing sort of the destruction or the elimination of Israel as a state was anti-Semitic. And then common expressions of anti-Semitism certainly came through conspiracy theories. Those also invoked many historical tropes of Jewish people controlling the world, controlling the media, or controlling banks and money in general. And then participants also identified conspiracy theories specific to COVID, that Jews were responsible for creating COVID or for spreading COVID, or that the COVID vaccines were a Jewish plot to gain control and money. So this is important because although COVID is new, the trope of Jews spreading disease or creating disease for some personal gain is certainly not a new manifestation of anti-Semitism. And many of the tropes that were experienced by our participants were tropes that have persisted throughout history. Okay. So we asked participants, which direction they think anti-Semitism is trending in Canada. And overwhelmingly, participants stated, 89% of them stated that anti-Semitism is increasing, either to a minor extent or to a large extent. Very few people indicated that anti-Semitism was decreasing to any extent. Okay, and as a follow-up question, we also asked participants, how big of a problem do they think that specific anti-Semitism or specific hate crimes were in Canada? And we found that most participants identified all of these issues as either a fairly big problem or a very big problem. And anti-Semitism online appears to be the most pressing issue, with 90% of respondents identifying it as a very big or a fairly big problem, and really only 10% identifying it as a minor problem or not a problem at all. Additionally, other areas of concern include the rise and presence of extremist groups, graffiti, and anti-Semitism in the media. We also asked participants about their personal experiences with anti-Semitism. And as we can see here, just over half, or 55% of participants indicated in the survey that they experienced some form of anti-Semitic incident, with the most commonly experienced incident being verbal harassment. And physical attacks were relatively uncommon, representing really only 5% of participant experiences. So asking about reporting, when asked whether or not participants reported any of these incidents, again, the vast majority indicated that they didn't. And the reasons that they provided were very similar to the ones that Professor Kotler was talking about in the beginning of the webinar. So they perhaps didn't think that it was serious enough, or that it wasn't violent, or that it happened too far back and they didn't think to report it at the time. Or perhaps the incident happened to somebody else, or they didn't think that anything would come of it. Interestingly, we also found that power dynamics were at play. So for example, a participant who's a student in an institutional setting might not feel like they're able to report because of potential repercussions to their academic studies. And finally, some participants didn't report because they didn't want to identify themselves in the report in case there would be repercussions to that. Of those that did report, most again found the response to be insufficient. And the primary reasons for that was that there was no response, or there was no follow-up, or even if a police report was made, that it rarely resulted in an arrest or additional follow-up. And the social media platforms are not very consistent in enforcing policies. Interestingly, though, during our interviews, we actually found that community leaders were more likely to report satisfaction with a police response and a positive relationship with a police service. And this might partly be due to the established communications and established relationships that community leaders and police services have outside of simply reporting hate crimes. So again, when we asked participants if anti-Semitic events occurred in their community, most participants indicated that it did, and this usually took the form of either protests, violence, or vandalism, which was most common. And responses to these events varied, but they included anger, disappointment, fear, and feelings of vulnerability and isolation. We were also quite interested in understanding the experiences of anti-Semitism on campus. And we found from our survey data that over a third of participants that attended a college or university campus, either as a student or staff or a professor, experienced some sort of anti-Semitic incident on campus. These incidents were mostly between students, but also included contexts of public events and protests or through posters and displays. And again, as we see through the patterns, that most participants did not report the incidents that they experienced. And those who did report, 80% of them did not find the incident to be handled appropriately. And the primary reason for that is that no action was taken by the administration. And then finally, through our interviews with participants and with community leaders, we found that students on campus are essentially being forced to make a decision to either hide their Judaism and their Jewish identity, or to actively respond to incidents of hate through advocacy or through activism work. And this can have an impact on students' academic experiences. Finally, we also wanted to know what the personal impacts of anti-Semitism are. And we asked participants if they modified their life at all as a result of experiencing anti-Semitic incidents. Most indicated that they did not modify their life in any way, although it was more common to modify behavior after having an anti-Semitic incident happen to you personally or witnessing one. And some of the common changes in behavior as a result of anti-Semitism include hiding or no longer wearing markers of Jewish identity. So perhaps tucking in your Magen David into your shirt so that it's not visible when you go on campus. Being cautious about divulging Jewish identity, whether that's at work, on campus, or in just general public spaces. And we've heard from a couple of participants that would perhaps, for example, refrain from speaking Hebrew while they were outside of their close friends circle. And then also participants indicated that they indicated an increased vigilance about their surroundings. So being careful about where to go and when, with whom to go, and staying away potentially from areas where there's a large Jewish presence. Interestingly, though, a small number of participants stated that they actually became more vocal about their Jewish identity, and that they began to participate more in Jewish events and community events because of experiences of anti-Semitism. And so with that, I'll turn over to Matthew.
Thank you. I'm going to talk to you all today about the qualitative responses and what we found in our interviews. As was mentioned earlier, we did 58 interviews that were spread across 34 follow-up interviews from people who completed the survey, and I believe 24 interviews with some community leaders. This has a bit of a mixture of both responses from community leaders as well as individuals within the community. I'm first going to talk about, and again, a lot of this has been talked about in the scope of the interview, in the scope of the survey. I'm going to talk more about the individual experiences that we were able to tease out of the interviews with some of these direct quotes. So first, I'm going to talk about some of the feelings that individuals had as a result of anti-Semitism. And the first one that people tended to describe was that of fear. One individual thought that their experience with anti-Semitism was that the Holocaust was going to happen again. Other individuals were not being identified as Jewish because they don't tend to dress in a religious way, so no one would know that they're Jewish, and being able to sort of fly under the radar. Individuals on campus not being particularly comfortable going to their local Hillel or to engage in other Jewish campus organizations because they're aware of the backlash that could happen by being seen at these Jewish organizations, and as well the politicized nature that we're seeing on campuses. And unfortunately, we're seeing these on campuses, at least across Ontario. I don't know if we had any interviews of students in universities in Quebec, but I certainly know that it was across many of the universities in Ontario. People feeling fear of walking around as a Jew, even in Jewish neighborhoods. And also this common understanding that Jews feel that never again isn't necessarily a reality. And there's a fear that with rising anti-Semitism, that worse can continue to happen. And this fear is generally increasing in the community. All right, the next slide, please. Another common theme across participants were feelings of isolation or alienation. Realizing that as one has a Jewish identity, that one might be targeted, trying to explain one's Judaism to other people, but not being understood. Oftentimes trying to potentially even differentiate the religious or cultural facet of Judaism that may or may not be directly associated for an individual with opinions and perceptions about Israel. And oftentimes as we're finding that anti-Israel and anti-Semitic attitudes are being intertwined, that we're seeing anti-Israel attitudes essentially making it seem okay to have more anti-Semitic attitudes and isolating the Jewish community as a result. Individuals being stopped and spat on campus by being told that there are too many Jews on campus, being uncomfortable being one of only a few Jews in the class, and having classrooms become politicized environments where, again, particularly anti-Israel attitudes are coming to the forefront, and power dynamics, oftentimes between students and professors and students and other students, becoming challenging battlegrounds for our younger Jewish population to have to navigate when they're already trying to get used to going into a university environment, which may, for younger students, may be a challenge in and of itself. Learning to feel that one is an outsider. We found that sometimes Jewish people had particularly younger Jewish people, but even across the age groups, having Jewish friends within their social circle, or being the only Jew in their social circle and not really socializing with other Jews. So that either isolation within the Jewish community or alienation in general. basically, even though feeling we are fortunate, and a number of participants mentioned that they were fortunate to live in Canada, and feeling an overall sense of safety living in Canada, there is this underlying feeling of alienation. Next slide, please. What I found to be most interesting, one of the most interesting and sort of most troubling, is the impact on Jewish identity. We're seeing sort of a polarizing response within the qualitative interviews that a number of individuals are hiding their Jewish identity in some capacity, trying to pass for non-Jewish, not really trying to fly under the radar with it. Not necessarily calling out when anti-Semitic remarks are made, just being quiet about it because you don't want to necessarily out yourself as being Jewish to potentially lead to people treating you differently. And really only identifying that one is Jewish when you find other Jewish colleagues in the area, and having that commonality that, oh, you're Jewish, I'm Jewish too, I can be a little bit more comfortable with you. That people are feeling discomfort in showing their Jewish identity is incredibly problematic. And one of the most heartbreaking stories that we saw in our interviews is a young girl who, this was in elementary school, who had another student carved a swastika on their desk. And they came home, they were terrified, and they asked their mother to take down the mezuzah from their front door because they didn't want to identify as Jewish. They didn't want to continue to be afraid of being targeted by other students who are doing these hateful things. And in many cases, and a lot of the younger population, or population who reflected on their younger times, sort of pass this off as people don't necessarily know any better, lack of knowledge, lack of awareness. But at what point is that a pass for some of these things, especially as we're seeing impacts on Jewish identity? We're also seeing some behavioral change that's happening. And I'll reflect back in a second. I realized that I was talking about sort of the polarized nature. I'll go to the more positive side of things in the next slide. Other behavioral change about identity is not going to websites where there are anti-Semitic groups like white supremacists, not necessarily participating as much in social media or having a lower profile, not identifying that one knows Hebrew in their languages, avoiding places that are more politically charged because, and this was an interesting thing that we haven't really touched on yet, is that anti-Semitism is really, people are being attacked with anti-Semitism from both the left side of the political spectrum as well as the right side of the political spectrum. So there's a lack of safe space in that regard to be able to have some sort of political alignment, because one is likely to be attacked from either side of the political spectrum simply for being Jewish. And finally, people being uncomfortable going to larger events and being involved in the community, because the community is now seen as a place where events are being targeted. We're seeing, unfortunately, a lot of people described, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, online webinars like this or online events like this, where there were Zoom bombings and swastikas and all sorts of terrible things were being posted in these environments. Next slide, please. On the other side of things, we're seeing a number of people proudly steering into being Jewish, more affirming their Jewish identity and being proud of being a Zionist, being a Jew, not being scared anymore, being empowered, fighting back whenever they can, being just as loud of a voice to combat anti-Semitism than the voices that are being anti-Semitic to begin with. And to really steer, to make that decision of not essentially, it's almost like a fight or flight response. And we're seeing both of these options across the participants, the perspective of the different participants. We're also seeing an increase in heightened vigilance. People being, there was a question in the chat of percentage of participants that changed towards advocacy. We didn't really have percentages in the qualitative interviews, but it's something that we can certainly tease out as we continue to analyze the data and sort of explore X number of participants hid their Jewish identity versus Y number of participants who really steered into and reinforced their Jewish identity. Continuing on with the heightened vigilance, we found that Jewish events, and especially the increase in security at synagogues, is, and we'll continue with this on the next slide, create this sense of vigilance and fear in going to these large public events, of this belief and fear that when you're walking in, is something going to happen? Do I need to be more hyper aware of my surroundings because of the potential of something happening? And especially people seeing the police presence around the synagogue, and that being a bit of a comfort, but at the same time also being a bit of a barrier to entry and to provide a bit more reticence. Finally, in along those lines, we are seeing that increased need for security in Jewish public spaces, particularly synagogues, community centers, and particularly in seeing responses after larger anti-Semitic incidents across the world. Like, we saw a lot of our interview respondents refer back to the event in Pittsburgh as really a defining moment in terms of reinforcing the security that's happening in their synagogue and public spaces within their communities. Sorry, I'm seeing a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe we'll address those after we do the formal presentation. Is that fair? I think so. Okay. Interestingly, a lot of the community leaders, as was mentioned earlier, indicated that there is a very strong relationship with local police. A lot of the rabbis in the communities that we interviewed had training, regular training, regular interactions with their local police forces to talk about security and safety in the community. And there's a pressing issue for people to make sure that synagogues and Jewish public spaces are safe. But at the same time, also, there's this constant awareness of the fact that we're putting so much money into increased security. And yes, there are government grants to help support, but the community is needing to support the additional infrastructure. And this money isn't necessarily going into education and synagogue-based events and really providing that sense of security. Finally, an interesting point that is talked about in terms of the increased needs of security, the fact that as our community, when events happen like this, one of the more positive outcomes of these terrible events that are occurring is members of other faith communities and performing these circles of peace, as they're called. So members of the faith community after Pittsburgh doing circles of peace around synagogues, as well as members of the Jewish community doing circles of peace around mosques after terror events are happening across the world. So there are shining lights of brightness within much of this darkness that's occurring in the hatred in the faith communities, in the Jewish community and beyond.
Okay, thanks, Matthew, and thanks, Irina, for that. And I'm going to finish up here by, Matthew referred to, we're talking about the dark side here, talking about the light side as well, and that is how we can move forward. What are ways forward in terms of combating anti-Semitism in Canada, which is one of the reasons why it's so important to have Professor Kotler here with us, because these are your marching papers, so to speak. But there's no variation here, I think, from what we've seen in the recommendations at the summit, what we're likely to see in the action plan as well. And I've worked with a lot of communities, done very similar work with a lot of communities, and this is fairly consistent in terms of the sorts of things that people would like to see. And so we did ask our participants, what can be done to prevent or to slow anti-Semitism from increasing in Canada. These were especially from the community leaders, but also from some of the other participants in the interviews in particular. They really talked about these 5 issues, and being self-serving, of course, and being scholars. We like to say that much of this needs to be underpinned by more research, broader research of the sort that we're presenting here, so that we do have that baseline. So we do have a very broad awareness of what those experiences are for Jewish individuals and communities across the board. So there is, of course, and I'm going to talk about education and public awareness together, there is a significant need and a perceived need for enhanced education and public awareness around Jewish identity, around Judaism, around the historical experiences of Jews, both domestically and globally. So that very important work that Professor Kotler will be involved in around reminding us of the consequences and the impacts of the Holocaust. I mean, though we have sadly very few survivors left now, how many years later, almost 100 years later, I think that the Jewish community still has very much that collective memory of the harm and the fear that is associated with the kind of escalation that preceded the Holocaust. As some of our interviewees in particular said, they were fearful that we were seeing that evolution from the rhetoric into the action. So I think just that, the ongoing reminder of, what that, if we think to the, ADL's famous pyramid of hate, what that pyramid of hate looks like, and if not checked at the lower level, how hate can escalate. So broad-based education, curricular reform, so that it is embedded in a curricula across our formal school system, educational system, but also broader public awareness. I mean, we don't have a lot of open conversations about anti-Semitism. We don't have a lot of public conversations about what it is to be a Jew in the 21st century. So even those sorts of very public conversations, I think, are very useful. And again, this is part of what the work we do is at the center, but also from this project is, to sort of carry this on the road, if you will, and to provide workshops and webinars and seminars and presentations around the problem of anti-Semitic hate crime specifically. The other piece is really one other piece is the criminal justice system and the way that it responds or doesn't respond to hate crime. I think what I found really interesting, again, I've been working in this space for years and years and years now. What I found really interesting was that, the level of engagement with law enforcement, and positive engagement very often with respect to the relationship between the Jewish community and law enforcement. I think especially in the GTA, and I think that goes, there's some thanks there to the hate crime units and some of the services here at the municipal and regional level as well. So we did see a lot of satisfaction, I think, to some extent, but also a recognition of the limitations of the capacity of law enforcement in terms of their level of training, in terms of even in some services, whether they had hate crime units who were attending to anti-Semitism, for example, that sort of thing. So there were issues on the enforcement side of what legislation already exists that obviously needs work. and then there was also, there were also conversations about the need for enhanced legislation. So the first thing is to more effectively enhance the legislation we have. And the second is that perhaps there are pieces that are missing, such as something akin to Section 13 of the Human Rights Code, the Canadian Human Rights Code, which was repealed some years ago, which provided protections, especially around hateful language. And when I say hateful language and hate speech, I mean really damaging, not just speech that hurts people's feelings or is offensive, but that is dangerous speech as well. And I think that that was really what we heard most in the interviews, was the need for something like that, and as well as around the online space, because of obviously, you saw early on the elevated level of experiences or concerns about online hate, and the need for legislative interventions in that space as well. And then the last thing that we saw, again in the interviews, was the need for enhanced institutional and political leadership in this space. And first of all, it's the institutional. So that really speaks to the problems that people express in terms of experiences of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic speech, especially in gestures and jokes in the workplace. So there were a number of people that expressed concerns about being targeted, being insulted, being, exposed to online or, offline caricatures of the Jew, if you will, being exposed to some of the, COVID conspiracy theories, for example, in the workplace, yet getting very little positive response from HR departments, for example. So very little support there. So I think it comes back to the education that people in those kinds of positions have around the significance, the impact of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic hate crime and hate speech. The other context in which people were calling for stronger institutional leadership was in the context of campus hate crime, campus hate speech. And that was something about which there was a lot of dissatisfaction, that, for example, universities and university leadership had not been at all effective in intervening where, Jewish students felt threatened, or Jewish students felt, as some of the interviews expressed, they felt as if they could not, sort of be politically engaged in a safe way. So that's the institutional leadership. And then the other side, of course, is the political leadership. And, as we were completing a few of the interviews, or, sort of closer to the end, I think there, sort of on the one hand, there was still this sense that anti-Semitism was not a priority. It was not front and center. And then we see, so much has changed in the last 6 months or so, with the appointment of Professor Cutler, but also the summit itself. I think, those pieces were the kinds of things that people are looking for, is that recognition, that acknowledgement, calling it what it is, naming anti-Semitism, naming anti-Semitic hate crime for what it is, in a way that acknowledges, again, the harm with respect to individuals and communities, but the harm that it does more broadly in terms of creating fissures in Canadian social fabric. So I think that is something, I'm happy to say, I think we are on the road there in terms of coming to grips with that. Although I will say I was disappointed by the sort of the silence, or the relative lack of conversations about anti-Semitism, or even Islamophobia for that matter, on the most recent campaign trail. So, it's not just something that happens between elections, but I think also is something that needs to be, front and center in election campaigns as well. And we'll see, I think probably the next big election we'll have coming up is the Ontario provincial election, probably next spring. So, we need to continue, I think, to push that agenda. And I think that does it for us, does it not, Irina? Yes, it does. Okay. So yeah, if you can just stop sharing there, we do have time for some of the questions and answers. And so for whatever reason, the Q&A has been disabled, but the chat is open and ready and waiting for your questions. So a couple of you answered along the way. So we have a question: do openly Jewish people experience more anti-Semitism than those who hide their Jewish identity? And you know, both of you correct me if I'm wrong. I think in terms of the interviews, the number of people, aside from the Magen David, the number of people that actually were sort of visibly Jewish was pretty small. So I think it's hard to do.
I think something that can be said is there was a lot of talk from the interviews of people who witnessed events, anti-Semitic incidents of people who were more openly Jewish. So witnessed events of people walking through Jewish communities and having things thrown at them, having anti-Semitic slurs yelled at them as passing by. So I don't think we could say definitively that more identified Jewish people would experience more anti-Semitism, but I think anecdotally and sort of from more general trends of what we're seeing, I would say that that's certainly definitively true. And I think the type of anti-Semitism experience is also more of a statement in terms of, I feel like the types of anti-Semitism that more openly identified Jewish people are facing are more overt, more aggressive in nature, versus those who are hiding their Jewish identity are seeing the anti-Semitic attitude sort of more passively, more subtly in terms of that. But again, it also is within the Jewish community as well. So I think these are things that we'll need to track over time.
Thank you. Thanks, Matthew. So the next question, just jumped down. Hi, Stas, thanks for your question. Could you elaborate on anti-Semitism on the left? What are some of the dynamics and frames of the left that are anti-Semitic? Do either of you want to go there? I think that was probably what we saw most in the context of some of the conflicts on campuses in particular, and in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And I think that's where we're primarily seeing it, that the anti-Semitism that's coming from the left is more based on vilifying Jews by affiliation with Israel, and generalizing the concept of what's going on, what may be going on at any given point in time in Israel, and particularly with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and using that as a jumping off point to anti-Semitism. And oftentimes it may start on a more political side of things, but then it morphs oftentimes, as we're seeing, and evolves into some of the more sadly traditional anti-Semitic tropes that we've seen throughout history.
Thanks, Matthew. This is an interesting question. So Domenico says, had an interesting discussion in a similar vein last week about a ban on Nazi symbology. Would anyone consider an outright ban on public anti-Semitism or Nazi imagery to be effective in reducing anti-Semitism? That's a tough one when you're talking about symbology, right? Because it morphs. I mean, you know, there are a lot of Odinist symbols that have been sort of exploited and co-opted by the far right and used, you know, as you know, sort of the traditional symbolism that they might use for tattoos or for patches or whatever the case may be. So that's a real challenging one when they are co-opting, you know, legitimate kinds of images in that context. Professor Kotler, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that one. Oh, you're still muted.
Yeah, these issues, of course, you know, raise free speech questions, and how far can you go with respect to prohibiting that type of speech. And I think, you know, a reference was made to the fact that, you know, there's a difference between something that is offensive speech and the kind of dangerous speech. And that's why we have an international treaty obligation which prohibits incitement to hate, hostility, and discrimination. So that there's an international responsibility there. And in terms of, our constitutional charter of rights and freedoms, we have an expansive protection with respect to freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and belief. But the charter does authorize reasonable limitations prescribed by laws can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So then you have to, further pour content into that. And I think the trilogy of cases that I mentioned earlier, Keekstra, Smith and Andrews, and Taylor, all decided by the Supreme Court, which joined them for a reference, and they were adopted in 2000 and decided in 1990, and then reaffirmed thereafter, provide appropriate sort of principles and precedents for when you can start to draw the line in these things. But then again, you have to look at context, etc. So there's certain principles of interpretation, which I don't want to get into, bore you with legalisms. But I think one begins with the basic foundational principles of freedom of religion. But one recognizes that even in the United States, which is the home of the First Amendment freedom, it's not true that all speech is protected speech. For example, perjury is not protected speech because of the right to a fair trial. Child pornography is not protected speech because, again, of the right to protection of children. Even false advertising may not be protected speech because of the right to consumer. So that there are carve-outs as to when a speech is not protected, because there are other interests and values that have to be weighed in that configuration.
Just to jump in for a second, and this may be a bit of a side step of the question, and I'm fully aware of this. I think that the Nazi symbology and the increase in Nazi symbology that we're seeing people using, particularly swastikas, I think that also speaks to the lack of education that we're seeing across the board about the Holocaust. And particularly, I think in younger generations, I think this speaks to the need for increased awareness and knowledge about what actually happened in the Holocaust, what those Nazi symbols mean, and the hate and harm that they cause. And it is not necessarily I think it's something that can go alongside the potential of a ban of that imagery, but I think it's an important thing that we need to continue to advocate and remember that education is an important facet, particularly in explaining what is behind that imagery.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, you mentioned, of course, the priorities with regard to education and raising of awareness. The studies have shown that amongst millennials, some 50% of millennials can't name one concentration camp or one death camp, or can't name, the Auschwitz death camp. So it shows the importance here and the need for education. At the same time, other studies have shown that even Holocaust educators are themselves uncomfortable about teaching the Holocaust. They're getting their information largely from social media, as they said, and the social media themselves have distortions now with regard to Holocaust distortion and the like. So I just want to mention that the Azrieli Foundation has just published now a teaching guide called First Steps with respect to teaching the Holocaust in the high schools, because we've got to start at that early age so that they don't come into the universities with an utter ignorance and then be susceptible, particularly to the explosive hate on the social media.
And I also wanted to add something as well. I think it's also a little bit tricky to try to ban sort of symbology or imagery just because it's the nature of sort of these fringe groups or of these extreme groups is that they are very creative in a sense, and they are very adaptable. And so even if you ban one image, or if you place restrictions on specific images, those kind of linguistic characteristics that these fringe groups employ are very likely to change. And so we're in essence almost trying to play a never-ending game of catch-up. So it does sort of bring up this idea that it's very difficult to effectively restrict symbology and image sharing or rhetoric, especially in online spaces where people can be sort of almost safe from direct enforcement.
Yeah, and I think, Irina, that really highlights the need for, the monitoring of, sort of, Nazi and far right, to some extent, I guess, far left as well, when they're engaged in the same kind of rhetoric, but the need to really monitor the rhetoric so that we do know, right, how that's changing, when it's changing, what the memes are that are being so broadly shared. I mean, the work that I've done with law enforcement, there are a lot of services that they might be aware, they might not be aware that there's activity, far right activity in their jurisdiction, but they're not monitoring them, right? The social media platforms, even the public social media platforms, for that kind of imagery, so they don't know it when they see it, so to speak. So absolutely that need for ongoing training and awareness in this area. Okay, so Brad raised a question for us. Where did it go? Is there institutional policy that post-secondary institutions might install to further protect students and staff from hate speech or hate incidents? How can we do better in this area? Who wants to have a go at that? Matthew?
It's a tough one because everything, and when I saw this question, I was trying to formulate a response in my head, and it's a genuinely tough one, because everything that we're seeing, at least in the interviews, is that post-secondary institutions and the administration are not particularly prepared to engage on this issue in any substantive way. We're seeing a lot of waffling and oftentimes a lot of backing down by post-secondary administration to protect students, staff from hate speech, hate incidents, or even going in any way, shape, or form. Like a number of participants mentioned reference that there was a motion at U of T to block the adoption of kosher products on campus to support the Jewish population, simply in relation, I believe, to the BDS movement and everything like that. And we're seeing that, at least in response to this, we're not seeing administration take or post-secondary institution administration take a strong stance to support the Jewish population. And unfortunately, is there a policy that they might install? Yes, sure. But are we seeing that they're going to? From every evidence that I'm seeing, not yet. And it's not particularly on the horizon, unfortunately.
Irina, from a student's perspective, do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, this is a very conflicting question, I suppose, because in my own personal experiences, I haven't felt anti-Semitism either here or at York University, which is my current institution. But I also understand that a lot of the participants, when they were talking about their frustration with their process, they specifically mentioned even the inability or the lack of desire for administration to even name anti-Semitic incidents as anti-Semitism, and that it it minimizes their experiences, it dismisses their sort of the consequences that they're feeling, and it makes them feel like they don't really have a choice or an option or some sort of avenue to go down. There's not really many options that are available for students if the administration doesn't listen to them, if the perpetrator or the offender of these anti-Semitic incidents are in fact, clubs or student clubs that are sanctioned by the administration.
I think one of the things that's just brought up now, if you look at the campuses, they increasingly understand the administration that they have to protect against a hostile environment, and they have, codes of conduct, equity, diversity, inclusion, etc. The problem is that very often that Jewish students are somehow held out to be part of the white privileged class, that they're not seen to be a part of those that need to be protected. And so you have a kind of situation where twofold. One, that anti-Semitism gets increasingly mainstreamed or normalized in the campus culture. And on the other hand, Jewish students get increasingly marginalized in the campus culture, and then anti-racism education and training tends to exclude anti-Semitism as part of that education and training for some of the reasons I mentioned. So these are things where one has to address, and administrators have to address. You want to protect against a hostile environment, and you want to have anti-racism education and training, and that is important. Then you have to have anti-Semitism as part of it, along with the kind of training and education regarding systemic racism against Indigenous peoples, Black people and people of color, Asian Canadians, Muslims, etc., but also against Jews.
So would you say then that at a minimum that university should be I'm running out of words today. Universities should be encouraged to adopt the IRA definition and to educate, not sort of through curriculum, but educate the administration itself and staff around what that definition means in terms of the kinds of conduct that we're talking about.
Yeah, the IRA definition is it's a working definition. It's a non-binding definition. Yep. It's basically there as an asset, as a resource, an educational tool. I was involved initially in its drafting that goes back now 20 years when we started in Stockholm, which then led to the IRA working definition. And those who have adopted it have found it a useful resource. Now, I'm not saying that definition, like any other definition, can sometimes be politicized or weaponized. But I'm saying, if used in good faith, then it is, as we meet, still the most authoritative, comprehensive, international consensus definition we have. And I would say the most representative, because it was democratically adopted over a 15-year process by intergovernmental bodies, governments, parliaments, civil society leaders, scholars, and the like. So what's missing by some who critique it, and it's fine to critique, is to understand that this grew out of a democratic decision-making process and anchored also in our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In one word, equal protection under the law, equal treatment before the law, etc.
Which applies to universities as well.
That's right.
Yeah. Right. Well, there's one other question there, but I think this actually refers back to what Matthew was talking about previously about, the relationship between being visibly Jewish and experiences of anti-Semitism. So I think if there are no other questions, we'll call a close to this. And I want to thank my colleagues, Matthew and Irina, for your hard work on this project and your conversation tonight. And Professor Kotler, I thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights, and really look forward to collaborating with you, working with you moving forward. Very, very excited about your role and the work to be done there. So please do stay in touch, and again, I saw some very familiar names out there. So thank you all for joining us as well. And happy to continue this conversation in other context. One of the things I should note is that, we're happy to sort of take our show on the road. If you have a workplace or community organization, Jewish or not, that you think would benefit from hearing some of our results, we're happy to tailor it to your needs. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. And many of you I know, work in the same space with us, and I thank you for that. And hope that you continue to slog away. There's so much work to be done here, such important work, and I thank you all for your engagement in that. So everyone, I hope you have a great rest of your evening, and hope to hear from you again soon. Take care. Bye now.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.